between the pagan world of Mesopotamia and the God of Genesis. Because on that clay in Akkadian cuneiform was carved a man warned by a god of an imminent flood. There was a colossal vessel built with precise dimensions given by the god. Animals were loaded 2 by 2. There were 7 days of storm. A dove, a swallow, and a raven were released to find dry land. And the ark came to rest on a mountain peak as the flood waters receded. It was the story of Noah, word for word, detail by detail, and it had been written by a civilization that never heard of Abraham, Moses, or the Torah, centuries before the oldest Hebrew manuscripts we possess. The question raised by this clay fragment placed on the table in 1862 has still not been fully answered, and it remains one of the most intriguing in human intellectual history. How can a story virtually identical to that of Noah exist in a completely different civilization in another language, with other gods in a text that came first? That is what we will discover in this documentary, step by step, tablet by tablet, verse by verse. To truly understand the impact of what George Smith read in that fragment, we must first understand where that text was born and the state of the academic world when it was found. We are talking about Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq, the region historians often call the cradle of civilization. It was here that the first named cities arose, the earliest writing systems, the first legal codes, the first astronomical records, the first administrative archives. Here, humanity learned to turn memory into symbols and symbols into clay. Between 1845 and 1891, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard excavated the site of Nineveh, the ancient capital of the Assyrian Empire, mentioned in the Book of Jonah, and found the library of King Ashurbanipal, a library of clay. More than 25,000 cuneiform tablet fragments piled among the ruins of a palace destroyed in 612 BC. These fragments were shipped to London, sitting for decades in boxes and on shelves at the British Museum, waiting for someone with enough patience to catalog them. George Smith was that someone, an engraver by trade, self-taught in cuneiform writing, who had convinced the museum to hire him as an assistant. And in November of 1872, while sorting through fragments that had passed through dozens of hands without anyone paying much attention, Smith picked up that particular piece of clay and read something that changed his life. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that very day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Genesis 7:11. The text that Smith had found was not Genesis, but it described the exact same event, forcing the world to ask if a Mesopotamian flood story existed with a 1,000-year head start over the known Hebrew manuscripts. What does this mean for the authenticity of Genesis, for the uniqueness of biblical revelation, and for the common origin of all human memory regarding the waters that covered the world? George Smith was born in London, the son of a working-class family, with no university education and no academic connections, lacking the kind of training that normally opened doors to the great research institutions of the Victorian era. He learned copper engraving as a trade and spent his free time at the British Museum, not as a tourist, but as a student. He sat for hours before Assyrian tablets, buying grammars and cuneiform dictionaries with his own money, learning to read signs that scholars recognized as writing, but which most of the population of his time considered decorative ornamentation. Smith taught himself cuneiform writing with the same obsessive meticulousness of a self-taught musician learning harmony, without a teacher or career plan, driven purely by love for the text. The museum finally hired him as an assistant, and it was in this role, not as a tenured professor, not as a field archaeologist, nor as a doctor of Oriental studies, did George Smith open the history of biblical archaeology. The fragment he read in November of 1872 was part of a series of 12 clay tablets, making up what scholars would eventually call the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving poetic narrative in Mesopotamian literature. The tablets were Assyrian copies from the 7th century before Christ, made from Akkadian originals dating back to the 17th century before Christ, which in turn were adaptations of even older oral traditions in Sumeria. The fragment Smith held was part of the 11th tablet, and what he was reading was the chapter on the flood narrated by a character named Utnapishtim to King Gilgamesh, who had crossed the ends of the earth searching for the secret of immortality. And Utnapishtim, who had survived the deluge and received eternal life from the gods as a reward, told Gilgamesh about the end of the world he had witnessed. Smith read about the god Ea, warning Utnapishtim in a dream that a flood would destroy all humanity. He read about the measurements of the vessel the man had to build. He read about loading animals, family members, and provisions. He read of 7 days of storm and flood. He read of the boat landing atop Mount Nisir. He read of the released dove that returned because it found no place to rest, the swallow which also came back, and the raven that did not. Every detail was an echo, a resonance, like 2 songs in different keys playing the exact same melody. And George Smith, a 32-year-old banknote engraver in a hallway of the British Museum, understood before anyone else the weight of what he held. And he also sent out a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the earth. But the dove found no place to rest its foot and returned to him in the ark, because water still covered the face of the entire earth. Genesis 8, verses 8 and 9. There are moments in human history when a single clay fragment holds more questions than an entire library of answers. What Smith felt in that hallway was not just academic excitement. It was the kind of vertigo you feel when 2 worlds that should be separate, the sacred and the secular, the revealed and the rediscovered, the biblical text and the pagan tablet, suddenly touch. The question was not, is the Bible false? The question was, what does it mean that the entire world remembered something only Genesis should have known? But before we can understand the parallels, we must understand the text that contains them. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not just about the flood chapter. It is one of the most extraordinary narratives humanity has ever produced. And it begins with a king who wanted to defeat death. The Epic of Gilgamesh begins with a king, and not just any king. A king whom Mesopotamian tradition describes as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, the son of a goddess and a mortal ruler of the city of Uruk, the largest metropolis of the ancient world in his time. Its walls were legendary. Its temples touched the heavens, and his power was absolute. The tablets describe Gilgamesh with superlatives that would be exaggerated if applied to any ordinary human being. They say he had seen it all, knew it all, and understood it all, that he had penetrated the secrets of the most distant lands, and restored the sacred temples after some ancient flood, engraving in stone all the wisdom he possessed for future generations. The Sumerian king list, a real archaeological document discovered in the early 20th century, includes Gilgamesh as king of Uruk, with a reign of 126 years, placed in the generations immediately following the flood. The list clearly identifies the flood as the breaking point between one era and another. Before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns began declining toward humanly recognizable spans. Historically, excavations at Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, revealed what archaeologists call the Uruk Revolution, the sudden appearance without any identifiable transition phase in the geological layers of all elements defining urban complexity. The writing, the administrative hierarchy, the monumental temples, long-distance trade, the calendar, the system of weights and measures. It all emerged at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. The epic introduces Gilgamesh as a brutal tyrant, a king who claims what the ancient clay tablets call jus prime noctis, the right to the first night with newly married brides, a ruler who drives his subjects far beyond their limits, a wild force of nature with no moral compass. Tired of the cries from the people of Uruk, the gods create a rival to restrain Gilgamesh, a wild man named Enkidu. Enkidu is formed by Aruru, the goddess of creation, molded from clay and cast out into the wild steppe, covered in hair, living among wild beasts, drinking from the same springs as deer, knowing neither bread nor clothing, before being tamed by civilization. Enkidu represents the original state of humanity before culture. And this is exactly where scholars see an echo of Adam the man, formed from the dust of the ground, placed in a garden, not realizing he needed clothing until after the fall. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu finally meet, after a fierce fight that the tablets describe, with the intensity of a clash of titans, They become brothers, inseparable friends. And together they set off on a series of adventures, slaying the guardian of the cedar forest and rejecting the advances of the goddess Ishtar. But when Enkidu dies, that the epic changes its tone forever. The tablets describe Gilgamesh weeping over his friend's body for 7 days and 7 nights, refusing to bury him until worms began to crawl. They portray the king who once defied the gods, tearing his hair, scratching his face in agony, and wearing animal skins to mourn. Gilgamesh does not just weep for Enkidu. He weeps for himself, because for the first time, this 2/3 divine man realized that his mortal fraction would eventually consume him. And it is this exact existential dread, not heroics, not glory, not adventure, that transforms the Epic of Gilgamesh into one of the most deeply human stories in all literature. An absolute monarch facing a final boundary that no human power can ever cross. The fear of death driving the most desperate search a human being can ever undertake. Gilgamesh sets out to find Utnapishtim, the only mortal who had received eternal life from the gods, the only one who had crossed the terrifying boundary that now haunts the king. And to find him, the king of Uruk must cross the waters of death, the supernatural ocean separating the living from the world beyond. For dust you are, to dust you return. Genesis 3:19. The Epic of Gilgamesh begins where much of theology ends, with the brutal awareness of our own mortality. Gilgamesh does not seek Utnapishtim out of historical curiosity. He searches because he is terrified. And this horror is deeply universal. The question driving Gilgamesh across the ocean is the very same one that draws humanity toward the sacred. Is there anything beyond death? If so, how do I reach it? The difference between Gilgamesh and biblical faith lies not in the question, but in the answer each tradition provides. When Gilgamesh finally meets Utnapishtim face to face, after a journey described in the tablets with epic grandeur, the immortal elder does not offer magic formulas or advice. He begins with a story, the tale of how the world ended. Gilgamesh, the great king of kings, sits by the edge of the eternal ocean and listens. Assyriologists consider the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic to be one of the most important texts in literary history, not just because of what it says, but for what it reveals about the collective memory of mankind. On this tablet, Utnapishtim reveals to Gilgamesh and to all future generations how the ancient world was destroyed by water. Utnapishtim begins his narrative by describing the city of Shuruppak, a real city identified by archaeologists on the banks of the Euphrates, which was actually buried under a layer of flood sediment dated by experts to around 2900 BC. This was where Utnapishtim lived, and where the gods gathered and decided to unleash the great flood upon humanity. What the clay tablets tell us next is truly extraordinary in its specificity. The deity who is identified in the ancient tablets as the god of wisdom and subterranean waters, having sworn an oath to the assembly of gods never to reveal their secrets, finds a clever way to warn the man without technically breaking his word. He approaches the reed wall surrounding Utnapishtim's house and whispers his warning directly to the wall itself. Technically, he isn't speaking to the man. You are talking to a wall. But Utnapishtim, on the other hand, hears every word. Ea speaks to the reed wall indirectly, telling the man who listens, leave your home, build a boat, abandon possessions, save your life, despise riches, preserve your breath. Bring the seed of all living things onto the boat. The dimensions Ea gives are precise. The vessel must be equal in length and width, essentially a square or a cube, quite different from the elongated biblical ark, but built with the same goal of riding out turbulent waters. The measurements include 6 decks divided into internal sections. Utnapishtim, according to the tablets, gathers carpenters and craftsmen. He kills cattle to feed the workers, gathering reeds and pitch to caulk the hull. In 5 days, the hull is ready. In 7 days, the vessel is complete. And then, following his instructions, Utnapishtim loads up everything he owns: gold, silver, the seed of all living things, his livestock, wild beasts, and all the craftsmen. The narrative describes the oncoming flood as a blackening of the southern horizon, thunder that shook the earth, winds that turned daylight into darkness. The tablets use imagery of war to describe the deluge, with storm gods attacking like fierce warriors. The floodgates of heaven opened, and the fountains of the deep burst. For 6 days and 6 nights the storm ravaged the earth. On the 7th day, the wind subsided. The sea grew calm, and the flood stopped. Utnapishtim opens a hatch. The text describes his reaction in a way that modern translators often quote as one of the most emotionally charged moments in all of Mesopotamian literature. He looks out and weeps. Where humanity was, there is silence. Where cities stood, only mud. The world's surface was as flat as a clay roof. The text says, Utnapishtim fell to his knees, sat down and wept, tears streaming down his face. The vessel came to rest on Mount Nisir, identified by some experts as the Pir Omar Gudrun range in northern Iraq today. Others suggest different locations, but the detail of the boat landing on high ground as waters receded is structurally identical to the Genesis account. Then Utnapishtim releases the birds. First a dove flies out, finds nowhere to perch, and returns. Then a swallow that also comes back. And finally, a raven that feeds, caws, and does not return. Utnapishtim takes the raven as a sign that dry land has appeared and releases all the animals to the 4 corners. And then a detail that George Smith surely read with wide open eyes. Utnapishtim climbs to the mountaintop and prepares a sacrifice, pouring out libations over vessels of reed, cedar, and myrtle. And the gods who went hungry during the flood, because there were no more human sacrifices for them, gather around the sweet aroma like flies. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking from every clean animal and clean bird, offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. Genesis 8:20, a moment of reflection. The sacrifice after the flood. The birds released to find land. The mountain as the final harbor, looking out and weeping at the total devastation. Each of these elements appears in both narratives with a specificity that goes far beyond mere coincidence. It is not just 2 people remembering a great flood. These are 2 ancient cultures remembering the exact same details of a single deluge. The sequence of the birds, the aroma of sacrifice, the tears over a ruined world. And this raises the central question that will dominate our next segment. At what point does coincidence end and hard evidence begin? Because when we place these 2 texts side by side, verse by verse, tablet by tablet, what emerges is not some vague similarity, but a precise surgical overlap. And that is where the real debate begins. There are ways to compare 2 texts. You can look at broad themes. Both talk about a flood. Both have a survivor. Both have a vessel. This is a thematic comparison, and any 2 flood stories worldwide would likely share these basic features. But there is another level of comparison. The comparison of highly specific details that are not essential to the plot, which easily could have been different. Details that do not stem from any unavoidable storytelling logic, yet still appear identically in both ancient accounts. This second layer is exactly what keeps scholars awake at night. First parallel, a divine warning sent ahead to one specific man. In Genesis, God speaks directly to Noah. In Tablet 11, the god Ea speaks indirectly to Utnapishtim through a reed wall. The format differs, and this difference becomes theologically significant. But the structure is identical. Out of all humanity, one man is warned. The rest have no idea what is coming. Second parallel, the precise measurements provided by the divine. Genesis 6:15 specifies, "And you shall make it this way, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high." Tablet 11 specifies measurements in Akkadian units that, when converted, result in a structure with a different proportion, a cube shape versus an elongated one, but just as specific. In both cases, the builder does not design the vessel, but receives instructions. The dimensions are revealed, not calculated. Third parallel, boarding animals. Genesis 6:19. It instructs Noah to bring 2 of every animal, male and female, to keep them alive. Tablet 11 tells Utnapishtim to bring the seed of all living things, his cattle and wild beasts. Both texts share the exact same concern, preserving biological diversity. Survival is not just about people. It is about saving the original creation itself. Fourth parallel, the family boards together. In Genesis, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives make 8 people in total. In Tablet 11, Utnapishtim takes his family, his craftsmen, and many others. The number and makeup differ, but the structure remains. The chosen survivor does not survive alone. His family is preserved with him. It is identical. Fifth parallel, the 7-day flood. Genesis mentions multiple durations. Rain fell 40 days and nights. The waters prevailed for 150 days. Tablet 11 packs the storm into 6 days and 6 nights, landing the ship on the 7th. The timeline is different, but the use of the number 7 as a turning point, the day the flood stops, appears in both traditions as a deeply symbolic number. Sixth parallel, the birds. This is what caught George Smith's eye the most in that hallway of the British Museum, because it is the most specific, the most gratuitous, and the most unnecessary from a narrative standpoint. In Genesis 8, Noah first releases a raven that flies back and forth until the waters dry up. Then he sends a dove that returns with nowhere to land. He releases the dove again, and it returns with an olive branch. The third time, it does not come back. In Tablet 11, Utnapishtim releases a dove that returns a swallow that returns, and finally a raven that does not return. The order of the birds is different. The raven appears last in the Mesopotamian version instead of first. But the logic of the test, releasing birds to measure the receding waters, and especially the detail of the raven, and the one that never returns, are parallels that go way beyond simple coincidence. Seventh parallel. The ship lands on top of a mountain. Genesis 8 verse 4 says, "And the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat." Tablet 11 describes the boat landing on Mount Nisir, different mountains with geographic locations still debated by experts, but the structure is identical. The ship does not stop in a valley, but at the very summit. The mountain is the first dry ground to emerge. Eighth parallel, the sacrifice. After leaving the ship, this is perhaps the most theologically dense. Upon leaving the ark, Noah immediately builds an altar and offers a burnt sacrifice. The Lord smells the pleasing aroma and seals the covenant. Leaving the ship, Utnapishtim offers sacrifices on the mountaintop and pours libations. The gods gather like flies around the sweet smell of the offering. In both cases, the survivor's first step onto the new land is not about celebrating exploring or building a shelter. It is about worship. It is an offering. It is the realization that this survival is not a human achievement, but a divine gift. And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant, which I make between me and you and every living creature with you for perpetual generations. I set my rainbow in the cloud as a sign of the covenant between me and the earth." Genesis 9:12. 8 specific parallels. These are not vague thematic coincidences. We are looking at precise narrative overlaps on points that could easily have been different. No logical reason forced both texts to agree on the dove, the immediate sacrifice, and the mountain as their final destination. These details only line up if both accounts are somehow connected to the very same source. The question is, what is this source? Did one copy the other? Or did both come from something that actually happened? But these parallels, as striking as they are, only tell half the story. Because when you stop looking at what is identical and start focusing on what is completely different, that is when the biblical narrative reveals a depth the Mesopotamian version simply cannot match. So far, we have tracked the parallels: the boat, the birds, the sacrifice, the mountain. Any honest reader has to admit these similarities are very real, highly specific, and they cannot simply be brushed aside. But an equally honest reader needs to look deeper, because when we read both texts in full, not just where they meet, but the entire story, what emerges are differences that are anything but superficial. These differences reveal radically different theological worlds. The first and most fundamental difference lies in the nature of the divine. In Tablet 11, the flood is not a unanimous decision. It is the result of a clash between gods. The god Enlil wants to wipe out humanity. The text suggests he is irritated by the noise humans make, which disturbs his sleep. The god Ea disagrees, but cannot openly contradict Enlil, so he uses a reed wall to warn Utnapishtim without technically breaking the divine pact. The minor gods are so terrified by the flood they unleashed that they cower like dogs at the edge of heaven. As the waters rise, the gods go hungry because human sacrifices have stopped. They are trapped, completely dependent on offerings from the very beings they just tried to destroy. In Genesis, there is none of this. There is only one God. No rivals, no opposing counsels, and no hunger to humiliate him. His decision to send the flood does not stem from annoyance over noise, but from a moral observation. The wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every intent of his thoughts was only evil continually. Genesis 6, verse 5. The biblical flood has a moral purpose the Mesopotamian flood completely lacks. Not because the stories differ in their basic structure, but because they stem from completely different views of who God is and why he acts. The second key difference is the reason why the survivor is chosen. In Tablet 11, Utnapishtim is warned simply because Ea favors him. It is a relationship of personal favoritism between the God of wisdom and this one man. The story never says Utnapishtim was morally superior to anyone else. It simply says Ea chose him. In the polytheistic world of Mesopotamia, being favored by a god was all about personal connection, not moral character. In Genesis 6, verses 8 and 9, the reason Noah is saved is clearly spelled out. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. He is not saved by some arbitrary favoritism. He is saved because of his character, his moral integrity, walking in a relationship with God that the text calls tamim, unblemished, pure, and complete. God choosing Noah was a revelation of who Noah really was. Choosing Utnapishtim simply revealed who Ea preferred. The third major difference is what happens to the survivor afterward. In Tablet 11, after the waters recede, the gods are in conflict. Enlil is furious to find that anyone survived. The flood was supposed to be total. Ea steps in and convinces Enlil to accept Utnapishtim's survival. As a reward, the gods grant Utnapishtim and his wife eternal life, sending them to live at the mouths of the rivers, a place far beyond the reach of ordinary mortality. Utnapishtim becomes an exception to human destiny, a divine anomaly. And that is exactly why he is useless to Gilgamesh. Because the way Utnapishtim achieved immortality was a unique, one-time divine decision. It is not a formula Gilgamesh can replicate. In Genesis, after the flood recedes, Noah is not turned into a god. Instead, there is a covenant. God does not make Noah immortal. God makes a covenant with Noah, and through him, with all humanity and every living creature, promising never again to destroy the earth with water. He sets the rainbow as the visible sign of this covenant. The biblical response to the flood is not about lifting one man above humanity, but restoring the connection between God and all of creation. The fourth difference, though less discussed, is just as revealing, lies in the moral scale of the project. On the tablets, the gods of the Gilgamesh epic make mistakes, regret them, and fight over what they did. They are powerful beings carrying the same moral weaknesses as the humans who imagine them. After the flood, the God of Genesis does not regret his actions in a way implying error. The scripture says, "The Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man." This is not the regret of someone who made a mistake. It is the resolve of one acting on a long-term plan that his creations cannot fully understand while they are living through it. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous and blameless man among his people. Noah walked with God. Genesis 6, 8, and 9. The parallels prove both texts share a memory. The differences show that the two traditions shaped this memory from completely different worldviews. One tradition viewed the cosmos as a battlefield for rival divine forces, where humans were merely pawns. The other saw the universe as the creation of a single moral God, where humans were responsible to him. The same flood, two irreconcilable theological worlds. What does this mean? That is the question we will explore in the next sections. Because the overlap between Genesis and the Epic of Gilgamesh is just the tip of a much larger phenomenon. Around 1920, a researcher started cataloging all the flood stories that existed around the world. The number he uncovered should settle any debate over whether the biblical flood was a local or global event. In 1929, a researcher named Sir James Fraser published a monumental study titled Folklore in the Old Testament, in which he catalogued flood narratives from cultures all over the world. The number Fraser uncovered,
and
which later researchers continued to expand, is around 200 to 300 distinct traditions in cultures that never had contact with each other, each preserving accounts of a great flood that wiped out humanity, telling of a single survivor or family warned beforehand and a new creation after the waters receded. 200 cultures across every inhabited continent, in languages that have never met, with belief systems that are radically different in every other way, yet converging at the center of their cosmology on the memory of when waters covered the world. The Ohlone tribes of California preserve the memory of a flood where a coyote and an eagle survived on a mountaintop. Yoruba oral traditions in West Africa include a flood sent by the god Olorun. Greek mythology tells of Deucalion and Pyrrha, warned by the titan Prometheus, of a flood sent by Zeus, building an ark that landed on Mount Parnassus. Hindu texts of the Mahabharata describe Manu, warned by the god Vishnu in fish form, of an imminent flood, building a boat that is tied to the fish's horn and pulled toward a mountain. Australian Aborigines in certain regions keep the memory of when the ocean covered the earth. Pacific Island populations, Polynesian cosmologies, and Mayan traditions in Central America. The explanation academic skeptics offer for this convergence is this: large local floods are common in any inhabited region near rivers or coasts. Memories of these events were amplified by oral transmission, becoming gradually more universal, more cataclysmic, and more cosmically significant as they passed from generation to generation. It is a technically possible explanation, but there is a structural problem. Local floods happen frequently. River floods, coastal tsunamis, and overflowing lakes are relatively common events in the history of any people. If these flood narratives were merely amplifications of local floods, we would expect a massive diversity of details, as each culture amplified their own specific local flood. Without these accounts, we would expect people in dry regions without floods. We would expect specific details like the early divine morning, the building of the boat before the disaster, the survival of one family, sending out birds to find land resting on a mountain peak, and offering sacrifices afterward to vary completely from one culture to another. These details do not vary randomly. They change in names and settings to reflect each group's local traditions. Yet they converge on structural elements with a consistency that the theory of localized flooding has a hard time explaining. People do not just remember water. They remember the warning, the boat, the animals, the birds, the mountain. The other explanation is simpler and far more staggering. These traditions share the same core details because they are memories filtered through centuries of storytelling and shaped by local cultures of one single event that actually happened. An event on such a massive global scale that no human survivors could ever truly forget it. An event that burned its memory so deep into humanity's collective psyche that it crossed every cultural, linguistic, and geographic border. And even today, whether in an Oxford archaeology lab or a South Pacific village, it resurfaces with the exact same bones. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that very day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Genesis 7:11. 200 cultures that never knew each other remember when water covered the world. This is not proof that everyone read the book of Genesis. It is proof they all lived through the same event Genesis records. Humanity's collective memory left a fingerprint, and it points in a direction that modern skeptics struggle to look at directly. The flood is not a metaphor. It is a memory. But if the flood is a shared memory, and the Epic of Gilgamesh is older than the earliest available Hebrew manuscripts, the question archaeology cannot avoid is which text came first. And the answer is more complex and fascinating than most popular debates would have you believe. This is the very heart of the academic debate that began when George Smith published his discovery in 1872 and it still has not been fully resolved. Finding the answer is not easy, and part of the difficulty is that those debating the issue often confuse two completely distinct concepts: the age of the text versus the age of the tradition. The physical evidence is this: the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh we have, which includes Tablet 11 and the flood account, is the standard Akkadian version, recorded on 12 tablets during King Ashurbanipal's reign around the 7th century before Christ. This version was compiled by a scribe named Sinleki-Unini from older sources dating back to the 11th century before Christ. Even older written versions of the epic exist. There is an old Akkadian version that experts date to the beginning of the 2nd millennium, around 1800 before Christ. We even have fragments of an older Sumerian version from the Ur-3 period, dating from 2100 to 2000 before Christ. The flood story also appears in a Sumerian text called the Epic of Atrahasis, dated to around 1800 before Christ, which many scholars consider the closest source for Tablet 11. Now look at the Hebrew manuscripts, the oldest copies of Genesis that we have with enough substance for textual study. Comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated between 250 before Christ and 70 after Christ. This places our oldest available Hebrew manuscript nearly 2,000 years after the first Mesopotamian flood writings in cuneiform. The leading academic theory that Genesis is derived from Mesopotamian tradition relies almost entirely on this gap in dates. But here is the main problem with that logic. Comparing the date of the oldest surviving manuscript to the age of the tradition itself is a major mistake. The Mesopotamian tablets we have are not the original source of the flood memory. They are simply written records of an oral tradition that existed long before any text. The 10th century version of Sinleki-Unini is a compilation of texts that had existed for centuries, which in turn were written records of oral traditions that had existed for millennia. The same is true of Genesis. Conventional scholarship dates the written composition of Genesis between the 10th and 5th centuries before Christ, with different schools debating whether the Yahwist text, the Elohist text, the priestly text, and the Deuteronomist text were composed sequentially or simultaneously. But even the latest date for the Genesis text is not the date of the tradition it records. The Hebrew oral tradition that Genesis preserves in writing is by definition older than the moment it was written down. Theologian and Assyriologist Tikva Frymer-Kensky, in a comparative analysis that has become a standard reference in the field, highlights what she calls a strategy of appropriation and transformation. Instead of viewing Genesis as a copy or derivative of Mesopotamian literature, she suggests the biblical writers knew these Mesopotamian traditions, deliberately used them as a starting point, transforming them so profoundly that the final text is theologically incompatible with its apparent sources. Similarity is not proof of copying. It is evidence of a conscious polemic. The biblical text responds to Mesopotamian cosmology, point by point, systematically deconstructing it. Another complicating factor for the simple derivation theory is the nature of the differences we have already analyzed. If Genesis were merely adapted from a Mesopotamian source, we would expect the differences to be superficial. Slight tweaks, adapted names, and minor cultural adjustments. Instead, the differences are structural. The monotheistic theology of Genesis is not an upgraded version of Mesopotamian polytheism. It is its systematic denial. The God who acts in Genesis is categorically different from the gods who act in Tablet 11. Scholar Kenneth Kitchen of the University of Liverpool, an expert in Semitic linguistics and Near Eastern textual comparisons, argues in a comparative study of narrative structures that the biblical version preserves elements of a simpler, more primitive form than the Mesopotamian accounts. The Mesopotamian versions display what textual scholars call epic elaboration, an accumulation of poetic, dramatic, and theological layers added to the original core narrative over centuries of transmission. The biblical account has a more direct and chronologically precise structure, featuring elements that Kitchen interprets as markers of historical narrative, rather than epic elaboration. If this structural analysis is correct, the biblical version would actually preserve the narrative closest to the original event, with the Mesopotamian versions representing later elaboration. All the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Genesis 7:11. The question of which came first assumes one text copied the other, but there is a third possibility, which scholars call a common origin. And in a way, it is the most radical of all. If both traditions independently stem from the memory of a real event, then neither copied the other. Both preserve, through different cultural lenses and distortions, the same fingerprint of an event that occurred long before any written text. This would position Genesis not as a derivative or a literary original, but as the most theologically accurate record of something the entire world remembers. And this is precisely where modern science entered the picture in a way nobody expected. Because while the theologians debated over derivation, and Assyriologists compared clay tablets, geologists and archaeologists were finding physical evidence that made the debate far more complex and fascinating. In 1928, archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the site of Ur of the Chaldees, the biblical city from which Abraham set out for Canaan, when his team reached, after meters of archaeological layers, a layer containing absolutely nothing. No pottery shards, no bones, no ashes from fires, nor any of the debris that civilizations inevitably leave behind. Just clay. A uniform layer of water-laid clay, varying in thickness between 2 and 4 meters, separating layers of human occupation in a pattern known to archaeology as flood stratigraphy. Woolley was thrilled. He wrote to his godmother, Mrs. Catherine Bully, claiming he had found physical proof of the biblical flood. His conclusion was widely published in British and American newspapers of the time, hailed as the archaeological discovery of the century. However, the reality revealed by subsequent studies over the following decades was far more complicated. The clay layer at Ur comes from a real flood dating back to around 3000 BC, but other excavations in southern Mesopotamia have uncovered similar flood layers dating to completely different times. One in Uruk dating to roughly the same period, one in Kish dating to around 3000 BC, and another in Shurupak, the city of Utnapishtim, from Tablet 11, dating to about 2900 BC. These clay layers do not align. They are separate events at different times, geographically close, but chronologically separated. This led some members of the academic community to abandon the idea of a global deluge, proposing instead a massive, large-scale regional flood, a catastrophic flooding of the Mesopotamian valley that would have destroyed all civilizations known to the people living there, without being global in an absolute geographical sense. An event of that scale would be virtually indistinguishable to those early civilizations from the perspective of those who survived from a flood that covered the whole earth, because the only world they knew had been completely submerged. In 1997, Columbia University geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman published a revolutionary hypothesis that once again shook the field based on analyzing sediment from the Black Sea. They proposed that around 5600 BC, long before any written records, before any urban civilization ever existed, the Mediterranean Sea burst through what is now the Bosporus Strait, catastrophically flooding what was then a massive, highly significant freshwater lake. The water level of the Black Sea rose catastrophically by several centimeters a day, flooding an inhabited area hundreds of kilometers wide. The coastal communities would have had time to watch the waters rise and migrate to higher ground, with some using boats to survive the transition. Ryan and Pittman propose that this event, not local floods in Mesopotamia, but this catastrophic Black Sea flood, was the historical source behind all the universal stories about floods, an event of a scale large enough that the populations who lived through it passed the story down everywhere as they migrated, carrying the memory of the flood to Mesopotamia, Europe, the Asian steppes, and beyond. The hypothesis is controversial. Other geologists debate both the timing and scale of the event, but it represents a paradigm gaining ground among researchers willing to ask the question that conventional archaeology prefers to avoid. What if the flood was real? Not necessarily with the absolute global dimensions of Genesis 7:20, where the waters covered the mountains, but as a real event of catastrophic scale, with a real survivor who passed it on preserved in humanity's collective memory, with strikingly consistent details over millennia of oral tradition, long before any clay tablet was written. And there is another piece of evidence that defenders of the flood's historicity often cite: the Sumerian king list. This document, found in multiple copies and dated to around 2100 BC, lists the kings of Sumer from the dawn of time. 2. It attributes reigns of tens of thousands of years to pre-flood kings in 5 cities, totaling 241,200 years. Then comes the phrase that changes everything: the flood swept over the land. The list resumes with the post-flood kings, whose reigns progressively decrease from thousands of years to hundreds, then to decades, until finally reaching historically verifiable numbers. This narrative pattern is structurally identical to the book of Genesis, a pre-flood era with extraordinary lifespans, followed by a catastrophic rupture, leading to a post-flood era of steadily declining lifespans. These are 2 independent traditions in different languages, preserving the exact same structure of what the world was before the floodwaters and what it became afterward. Noah did this. According to all that God commanded him, so he did. Genesis 6:22. Science has not proven the biblical flood, but it hasn't disproven it either. What archaeology, geology, and comparative linguistics have done is reveal a picture far more complex than the myth versus reality debate that dominates popular discussion. Actual floods exist in the geological record. 200 independent cultures share converging memories. 2 ancient narratives exist, one Hebrew and one Mesopotamian, with precise overlaps that cannot be explained by accident. The question isn't whether evidence exists, but what we do with it. And that is exactly the question we have arrived at now. The exact point where all the threads we have woven throughout this documentary tie into a single knot, the revelation that changes how we read both Tablet 11 and Genesis. We have reached the point where we must pause, take a breath, and face the question demanded by all the data we have gathered throughout this documentary. If the Epic of Gilgamesh is a forgery or a baseless myth, why does it contain details that only make sense to someone preserving an actual memory? The specificity of the birds, the location on Mount Nisir, the mud of the ruined world, Utnapishtim's cry as he opened the hatch. These are not the elements of some generic flood myth. They are the details of a memory. And memories have sources. If Genesis was just a copy of Mesopotamian tradition, why are the differences so systematically profound? A text that copies another does not usually rebuild the entire underlying theology of the work it is copying. It does not turn polytheism into monotheism. It does not transform divine whim into moral judgment. It does not replace arbitrary favor with human integrity as the selection criteria. These are not mere cultural adaptations. They are entirely different theological worlds that could never have evolved from one another. The most sobering, honest, and fruitful conclusion, supported by the available data, is this: there is a real event behind all of these flood narratives. An event so catastrophic and geographically massive that no human population living through it could ever completely forget it. The memory of this event was passed down orally for centuries, perhaps millennia, before any text existed. When Mesopotamian civilizations finally recorded their traditions in clay, they captured that memory, filtering it through their polytheistic cosmology, with their warring gods, arbitrary favors, and inconsistent morality. When the biblical authors recorded the same memory at whatever date we assign to the composition of Genesis, they also processed it through their cosmology. But biblical cosmology is not just slightly different from the Mesopotamian worldview, it is its structural antithesis. And this antithesis is not mere poetic fluff or cultural adaptation. It is a bold theological statement. The flood you heard about was real. It happened, but you did not understand its meaning. It was not the result of a war among gods. It was the act of a single moral God who cared enough about creation to refuse to let it be destroyed from the inside out, caring enough for one man to preserve the continuity of the original design within him. Gilgamesh seeks out Utnapishtim to find a way to escape death. And Utnapishtim's answer is, there is no way. He survived the flood only through the unrepeatable favor of a god. The immortality I received is not transferable. There is no formula, no way. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, empty-handed. Noah in the biblical text does not seek immortality. He walks with God, and he does not receive Utnapishtim's personal eternal life. He receives a covenant, a promise that spans all creation, a rainbow that is not just meteorological poetry, but a visible sign that the God who acted in the waters is also committed to what emerges from them. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the most beautiful and human works of world literature, but in the end, its answer to the question of death is silence, the eternal ocean that no one crosses. Genesis answers that same question with a covenant, and it is this difference, not the dove, the ark, or the birds, that is the true revelation separating the two texts. I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be destroyed by floodwaters, nor will a flood destroy the earth. Genesis 9:11. What God was doing with the flood in the biblical account was not destruction for destruction's sake. It was about preservation, a flat-out refusal to let corruption become permanent. And the rainbow appearing at the end is not just a weather event. It is the signature of a God who, even after the harshest judgment in history, remains committed to his creation. Gilgamesh did not find this answer across the sea. It was available to Noah without crossing any ocean. Just walk with God. If you have watched this far into this documentary, I doubt it is just out of curiosity about clay tablets and ancient floods. I think you are here because something in this story touches a deeply real part of you. The first lesson from this parallel between Genesis and the Epic of Gilgamesh is this: our collective memory points to something real. 200 isolated cultures that never met all remember when waters covered the earth. This phenomenon demands an explanation, and the one that most honestly fits all the data is that something happened. An event massive enough to imprint its memory deep within the human psyche. When the Bible claims the Great Flood was real, it is not demanding blind faith against evidence. It makes a statement that echoes what the entire world independently remembers. The second lesson lies in the difference between Noah and Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim survived because of a God's arbitrary favor. Noah survived because he walked with God. And walking with God in a time when an entire civilization had abandoned that path was no small thing. He had to swim against the current of everything around him. And you, living in an age where the values around you often point in directions that your conscience and faith label as wrong, do you know what it means to walk in the opposite direction?
Noah's integrity was not passive. It was active resistance in a world of total corruption.
And the text records that this very integrity is what made all the difference. The third lesson comes from Gilgamesh, the most powerful king on earth, who built the grandest walls, defeated fearsome monsters, and achieved a fame that texts say will last forever. Yet he fell to his knees when his friend died, realizing his power was useless, and began a desperate journey for something that power cannot buy. There is something deeply modern about this image. How many versions of Gilgamesh exist today with all our technology and comfort, all our achievements sitting at the edge of the eternal ocean with empty hands, realizing that nothing we have accumulated answers the one question that truly matters. And you, in this season of your life, carrying both achievements and fears, what are you searching for across that ocean? What if the answer you seek is not at the end of some long road, but available in the simplest, most radical act of all, walking with God? As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be when the Son of Man comes. In the days before the flood, people were eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. They suspected nothing until the flood swept them all away. Matthew 24:37-39. In 1872, George Smith entered a quiet hallway in the British Museum, picked up a clay fragment. He read it, and in sheer excitement actually began to undress. He had found the echo of a familiar story, a text that no mere coincidence could explain. What George Smith felt in that corridor was not a sense that the Bible had been undone by the discovery of Tablet 11. It was the exact opposite, the feeling that the entire world, including a pagan culture with different gods, another language, another system of values, had preserved the same memory found in Genesis, as if the flood was too massive to fit into one single text, as if it took 200 traditions to fully remember it. Noah did not need to cross an eternal ocean or chase secrets of immortality. He walked with God when the rest of the world had stopped walking. And when the waters covered the earth, he was safe inside a wooden vessel built with his own hands, following a plan that was not his own, sailing above the ruins of a world that refused to heed the warning. The clay of Nineveh and the text of Genesis diverge in theology, but they converge in memory, pointing together to a single conclusion. Something happened, and it was so massive that the whole human race, from Uruk to the Amazon rainforest, from Polynesia to the Arctic, still carries its imprint in our collective memory. In our next video, we will explore the world that rose after the floodwaters, the civilizations after the flood, the giants that returned, and the mystery of the Tower of Babel. It is a story that modern archaeology is starting to uncover, and ancient biblical texts recorded long ago. If this documentary changed how you look at the Bible and ancient history, please leave a like, not for our sake, but because it shares this message with others asking those same deep questions. Subscribe and hit the bell. Our next story will go even deeper. The waters receded, dry land emerged, and on a mountaintop, a man built an altar. Not just because he survived, but because there was someone to thank.
Oh,